So today I wanted to talk to you guys about perhaps a little bit more of a sensitive subject in today's After Hours, because I wanted to focus a little bit more on slavery at the time of the founders. Because as we all know nowadays, hindsight's always 20/20, and as we've evolved as a civilization, become a global community, we've all realized how wrong slavery is, that you shouldn't be able to own another person. And we've allowed that to come back and taint the memory of our founding fathers, men like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and, George Wythe and all these others, in which they were slave owners themselves. And despite all the good that they did for the country, we can sometimes have that be distracted by the fact that they owned slaves. But I want to emphasize here that slavery was a difficult issue back in the day. It wasn't merely as simple as, one, recognizing that it was wrong, because it was pretty common throughout the world. Up until the point of the revolution, for the majority of the founders, the entire world thought slavery was pretty okay. I mean, in the developed world of Europe, the empires, right, they were more than happy to utilize slave labor in order to help bolster their imperial ambitions. But for the founders, they started to have the inklings of realizing that, no, all men are created equal. And we even see that as they write that into the Declaration of Independence. And particularly, I also want to make a point with the Declaration of Independence that in the first draft of the Declaration of Independence, there was a point in which they talked about the inalienable rights to life, liberty, and property, because, you didn't want the king to be able to have the right to take what you rightfully owned. But they also recognized and understood, the abolitionists within the founding fathers recognized that if they had wrote that in, they had also written in the legacy of protecting slavery, because slaves were recognized as property, and therefore it was changed to the pursuit of happiness. Thomas Jefferson's first draft, for all the contradictions that man had, his first draft of the Declaration of Independence is wildly entertaining, essentially berating King George III for imposing slavery upon the colonies and upon the states, and how it was so difficult for them to be able to change that later down the line. We even see that, as I discussed in the episode with Virginia, that you actually had to have permission of the state in order for you to be able to emancipate your slaves. And that really didn't change up until 1782 with the Manumission of Slaves Act, which allowed plantation owners who wanted to free their slaves to be able to do it a lot easier. Now, as far as what the motivation of that could be, there could be further debate on whether or not they wanted to rid themselves of free blacks and the ideas, or if they wanted to, legitimize that fact that all men were created equal and that they shouldn't be owned as slaves. That could be up for debate. But again, it just gives you an inkling into how difficult it was for many of the abolitionists at the time, especially in states where slavery was a major part of the economy, that it wasn't so easy to be able to get rid of. I mean, let's look at George Washington, for example, who married into most of his slaves. With the inheritance laws of Virginia at the time, he wouldn't really even have the option to be able to emancipate his slaves, at least not through really easy means. They would be a very difficult way for you to be able to do it. Not to say it was impossible, but it wasn't easy. And considering our modern world, I think it's important for us as well to recognize that slavery still exists. There are areas of the world where, sadly, slave labor is used, and sometimes it's used to make goods that make our lives easier, And we also have to recognize that, yes, slavery is wrong, and it was horrible, and it was really unfortunate that it was a part of the American life and the American economy and part of the American culture for such a long time. It is the great sin of our nation, but it's still a sin that exists today, and I think that we should equally recognize that as much as it was our duty to destroy it in our country, we should also destroy the practice throughout the world today, and we should continue to bolster our efforts to make sure that slavery is taken out from the rest of the world. And hopefully, as a people, as a nation, to recognize the evil that was slavery in the past is important. But also, I hope that we also recognize the good that our founding fathers had, because we have a nation that is incredible, that is welcoming. And despite all the problems that we may have in our modern day and all the people that say that we're at each other's throats, let's also recognize that we are very lucky to live in the time that we live in and in the place that we live in, because we could be living in a country where slavery is still legal. We could be living in a country where lives are more difficult. So let's come together in the fact that we are so wealthy and so fortunate, and be able to use the good fortune that was built on the ideas that these founders had. Even though they weren't able to cash in on the promissory note for everyone, let's begin to cash it in now and extend that idea to the rest of the world, so that we know that we can eliminate this particular issue, this sin, from the entirety of humanity.